Hey folks, I just wanted to talk a little bit about a segue into this first chapter that we're going to be covering in the book. This one is on labor and capital, and this chapter is kind of cool. It moves into industrialization and stuff like that. Well, here in the South, we're not really going to do that. We're still going to remain very, very much an agricultural economy down here. And there's a tremendous amount of labor following the Civil War and the post Civil War years. Um, there's still a lot of landowners after the Civil War, even though those plantation owners that owned a huge swaths of land. Uh, Decatur, Calhoun College here in Decatur. Uh, the spot that we are sitting on, this particular spot of land, was a 3,000 acre plantation prior to the Civil War. Well, even though the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and so the owners of this particular plot of land, they lose their enslaved people, they're still, holding on to 3,000 acres of agricultural land. And so they're still able to use that, but they just don't have existing labor on hand. They don't have that enslaved labor anymore. So I'm looking for a pen. What they're going to do here in the South is going to develop a system called sharecropping. And what goes on in sharecropping, and this can be fair, sharecropping still exists today. It absolutely can be a fair system of labor. What happens there is that, say we have a field, let's say we have 3,000 acres. And so uh, the landowner will contract usually with newly freed African Americans. There are going to be some whites that do this as well, but for the most part, newly freed African Americans are going to take part in the system because they don't have a lot of other options for labor, for employment. But let's say, the former enslaved people that worked on this plantation, they don't have any money to go anywhere else. They don't have the ability to really start a different career path. There's not really one of those available. They're going to continue to farm like they always have. Uh, and there's kind of more or less, some are gonna leave and go out and find other places, but for the most part, most of the African Americans that were working on this land are going to continue to work on this particular plot of land. And sharecropping, the way it works though, is at the end of the harvest, the landowner would pay those sharecroppers a share of the crop, a share of the harvest. Um, and so you work basically all year, and just like any other farmer, you get paid at the end of the harvest. The landowner is going to keep most of the crop because it's their land, it's their tools, it's their seed, all this stuff. And so the sharecroppers themselves, they're providing the labor for that. And there's a surplus of labor, and so we're not going to pay them very, very much. And like I said, this can be a fair thing, and it still exists here in the American South. People still do sharecropping. But since we're able to, and since we're the landowners, we're going to set this up to where it's absolutely super, super unfair. Uh, so let's say, for example, this is what I was looking for a second ago. Let's say we're paying people in pens because I don't have a bunch of dollar bills laying on my desk. And so we're going to, your portion or the sharecropper's portion of the crop at the end is $3. You're going to make more than that as a sharecropper, but just, for simplicity's sake. However, the sharecropper for the last year has lived on the land that the property owner owns, and they've lived in, usually those former slave shacks uh, as a residence. And so that usually you could probably rent something like that for fairly cheap. But since the sharecropper doesn't really have a choice in the matter, the landowner typically is going to overcharge them. So you might get away with, I don't know, for our example, a $0.50 or $0.75 of a dollar or something like that. But we're going to overcharge, and so we're going to take one whole dollar out. So you're left with two. Also, though, the sharecropper had to eat this whole year, and to feed their family. Well, again, you could probably, if we're being fair, this might run, just kind of guessing, and I'm just pulling numbers out of the air here, but just say, also $0.75, 75 cents would possibly feed you for our example, but you don't have a choice. The sharecropper doesn't have a choice, and so the landowner is going to overcharge them for food. Uh, you're now left with a dollar. Well, you as the sharecropper have used seed on your portion of the crop. You've also been using the landowner's tools, so you're going to have to pay wear and tear on those. Your family has required clothing throughout the year, so you're going to have to pay for that stuff. And so basically, at the end of the year, you have nothing left. Now, the landowner is going to figure out something, whether it's for a little bit more overcharging the stuff that we've already charged for, or coming up with something else. The landowner is going to come up with something a little bit extra to charge his sharecroppers for, and that way the sharecropper, anyway, I keep on saying the sharecroppers are going to end up in the hole. They're going to end up in negative numbers at the end of the payout for the harvest. Well, one of the big things, and the book talks about this a little bit, especially in the earlier Reconstruction chapter, I think it's chapter 16. Um, After the Civil War, as much as possible, uh, Southern states are going to put out what are called Jim Crow laws. Sometimes they're also called the Black Codes. These are laws that are meant to really oppress African Americans and keep them into this sort of second class citizen territory as much as possible. Well, one of those that gets passed in most Southern states is that you're not, especially if you're in a sharecropping situation, you're not allowed to quit your job and move on to another job unless you and I are square. So you have to pay off, the sharecropper has to pay off all of the indebtedness that he owes to the landowner before he can leave. Well, it's going to be impossible to do that. And so um, another historian, much before me, has called this actually slavery part two, because if you think about it, we've got a group of people, these sharecroppers, formerly enslaved people, but now are newly freed African Americans, and they're going to have to work in the same trade that they have worked for the last, before slavery ended, and they're not allowed to leave because the system's set up so that they're not allowed to depart. They're not allowed to quit and find a better job because they haven't been able to pay their way out of this indebtedness. And so sharecropping usually, probably 99.9% of the time, is absolutely, for right now, going to be very super unfair and oppressive uh, toward anybody that gets wrapped up in it, especially though the largest group of people that are African Americans. And so this is really going to keep African Americans in that super bad, oppressive status for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. So that's one of the ways that the South kind of adjusts to not having an enslaved population to do all this agriculture. We're just going to shift into a slightly freer, not a lot, but slightly freer concept of sharecropping. And so that's the solution to this labor issue here in the South. We'll talk about some Native American issues next time. See you then. Bye.